now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Jessica Alexander, who will be giving a talk called Writer's Block, the Anecdotal as Antidote. One of the things I admire most about Jess as a writer is that while she is the sole author of multiple books, her story collection, Dear Enemy, won the Subito Prose Contest, and her novel, Agnes, We're Not Murderers, is forthcoming from Clash Books. She often works in collaboration with other writers, not only on writing projects such as the novella None of This is an Invitation, co-written with Katie Jean Schinkel, or the book That Woman Could Be You, co-written with Vicky Now, but also by hosting salons at home with her partner and by showing up in community spaces in support of others. Jessica Alexander earned an MA at Ohio University and a PhD at the University of Utah. She has given talks and taught courses on queering the thriller, the poetics of queer comedy, and hauntology. After teaching for several years as a professor of creative writing at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, Jess now lives in Iowa City full-time. She's teaching a course for the festival next month called Mystery, Suspense, and Fascination in Fiction and Nonfiction. And that course runs from July 14th through 19th and still has seats left. We're so happy to have her here today, giving a lecture on the way our ability to tell stories and share anecdotes in our daily lives can be harnessed for our writing. I'm grateful for any approach to writing that works from the ground up, that shows that writing doesn't come from some untouchable place on high, but is right there, embedded in ordinary life, waiting to be plucked. Please welcome Jessica Alexander.
Okay, fantastic. Happy Juneteenth. Thank you everyone for coming out. Thank you, Becca, for inviting me to read here and for that lovely introduction. Thank you, Danielle, and to the festival staff for putting this event together. So I've been thinking a lot about anecdotes and this sort of compulsive act of narrativizing our experience, sometimes even as we're in the midst of living it. And I have a few stories that I've been telling compulsively. How many of you tell the same stories kind of compulsively? Like repeatedly, like you've got an arsenal of stories, and if you've got a close loved one, they're like, oh, here they go again. Yeah, okay. And they're not exciting stories, the ones I tell. There's no moral. I have no wisdom to impart. Nothing all that extraordinary happens. Honestly, they're kind of banal. So I've been wondering why. Why do I tell these stories compulsively? What need or desire is being served here? And I'm going to tell a few of these stories. But I just want to wait a minute, and I want to ask you all to kind of think about a few stories that are in your arsenal that you tell repeatedly, and just jot them down if you've got a pad in front of you, or you can just kind of store them in your memory, however you want to do it. If you're not like me and you don't have this arsenal of stories that you repeatedly tell, then think about the last couple of times that you told a story, or think about an event that you experienced and you wanted to turn it into a narrative, but you haven't had the opportunity yet. So just take a minute there. All right. My first story is set a few years ago, and it happened immediately after the death of my youngest brother, Jim. And when I learned of his death, I was living alone in Louisiana. And maybe 10 hours later, I was on my way to Little Rock, Arkansas, where my whole family was going to convene. So a lot of my grief was happening on the road while I was driving a car. And I was about 10 minutes out from arriving at my destination when one of my living brothers called, and he said, he texted, and he said, "Can you get some feminine hygiene products?" And it was just like my brother to text something like, "Can you get some feminine hygiene products?" and then vanish when I ask for greater specificity, like as if a whole aisle in Walgreens isn't dedicated to that genre. So I'm 16 hours into my grief, and I arrive at the counter of Walgreens holding like a pretty comprehensive assortment of feminine hygiene products, and I'm also sobbing volubly. But the thing is, I kind of start to smile too, and I sort of start to laugh in this moment because I'm thinking, I can't wait to tell my brother Jim this story. Whenever I talk about my brother's death, this is the story I tell, because I think instead of estranging me from people, the way grief can often estrange us, and the way I also felt estranged when I was standing in that Walgreens, it creates a community through shared laughter. Jokes and humor are ways of forging a community of people with shared values and sensibilities. And I think by extension, stories do this, the stories that we're telling in our everyday lives. And the stories that I tell are usually about social shame or humiliation, moments where I lack that community, moments when the people around me lacked the context, the values, or the sensibilities to read me in that moment the way I wanted to be read. And it's because of this sense of alienation or lack of community that I conjure my ideal audience. It's like moving a traumatizing event into a new context. And in this case, I conjured my brother, one of my favorite listeners, and the joke for that reason was sort of on me because I'd forgotten that my chosen audience member had ceased to exist, but that's also like a really fundamental part of grief. But more generally speaking, I think the social humiliation story helps us endure discomfort and alienation. Sometimes we tell ourselves a story as an event is in the midst of unfolding to remind ourselves that it's going to end, and we have a community on the other side of that moment. Sometimes I think we keep telling a story to keep meeting the need we had in that moment that went unmet. Have you ever been in a situation that's bad, but then it kind of hits a tipping point where the badness reaches a level of absolute absurdity, and you actually become kind of gleeful? Because you realize that you're in the midst of living what will probably be one of your best stories. And you're telling it already. And in telling it, you've transported yourself to a place outside the present, a place of comfort. You're telling yourself you'll get through this, and eventually you'll exist among friends again. And it's like a switch flips. Like all of the frustration you're feeling just evaporates, and your mind is awake to a sense of nuance and the strange. And if I could turn that phenomenon into a New Yorker cartoon, it would be like a single gas pump that's like really rusty in the middle of nowhere. And then there would be a car, and there would be like all of this smoke coming out of the car. And then there would be a person standing in front of a barn full of chainsaws, and they'd be texting, "There is literally a barn full of chainsaws, LOL." So for exercise 2, I actually want you to think of one of those stories. And earlier I told you to think of like a few of the stories that are in your arsenal of stories. And there are 2 ways that you can approach this exercise. If you want to turn to the person sitting next to you and tell them this story, you can do that. You can also record it on your phone and ask your phone to transcribe it for you. That's also something that you might avail yourself of. But you can also, if you're more into sort of like journaling about this or typing, you've got your laptop out and you're shy right now, then you can do that. But what I would urge you to do, if that's the option you want to take, is to really visualize the other person you're telling it to. And to really like imagine them, and like imagine like not thinking about the page so much, but like really trying to transcribe the way you'd speak this story. All right. You may begin. All right. It was really nice to watch everybody get so animated in their storytelling that I almost just wanted to allow you to keep going. Like, I'm just gonna leave. I've done my job is done here. But if you retain something from the experience, kind of like, I guess, just kind of think about how telling that story to another human being is sort of different than telling a story or sitting down and writing something on the page. A few months ago, my mother showed me this letter that I wrote to her when I was in college. And I had been reading a lot of George Eliot and like philosophers. And it was really negatively impacting my prose style. Like, I kept like leaping from these really particular things to these really kind of broad universal statements about the nature of mankind. Like the first sentence of the letter is something like, I'm sorry about the artichoke. When one is in the grip of great fear, it is common, I suppose. And like I read that and I was like, yeah, but what about the artichoke? Like what happened? So I know I didn't go around talking like that. Like I would sound like an idiot. So what was I doing writing letters that way? And honestly, I wish I knew how I would have spoken about this experience to my mother or just another person instead of having kind of the narrative clouded by this idea I had of like what good writing was. And like allowing that to kind of get in the way of what seemed like it might have been a kind of interesting story. But I also think speech can have this sort of charge and this intimacy. And we don't really speak in abstractions. But I think that we also do repeat ourselves a lot when speaking. Sometimes we keep circling a subject again and again, at least I find myself doing this, because I'm trying to land on the insight. Like I'm sort of editing myself as I'm going. I'm in search of the meaning of my own story as I'm engaging with somebody else. And that kind of dual activity of speaking and thinking at the same time can sort of help me arrive at my greatest revelations. Sometimes we don't have that kind of patience for ourselves when we're writing, right? We want that first line to like be the revelation. So if you've like transcribed your narrative, or if you just still have this kind of fresh memory of what it was like to tell that story in sort of spoken word, I hope that what you can do if you want to crystallize that into a work of writing is to sort of allow space for those revelations and allow space for that kind of sense of speaking to another human being and all of the sort of desires and needs that are tucked up inside of that experience. Like, you know, when we speak to somebody else, there's something we're offering them. We want to give them joy. We want to give them a sense of community, but we also want these things for ourselves. There's a kind of desperation that's tucked up inside of interpersonal dynamics when we tell these stories. And so I would want, if you were to transcribe a story that you told, and an activity that you can do later that I'd encourage you to try out is to sit with a trusted friend and just record yourself telling a story. And our phones these days have that ability to transcribe it into written word and go back and kind of try to retain that sense of speaking and engaging with another human being, but also maybe hone that kind of repetition out. So there's another story that I tell, and it is not dignified. And it started 15 years ago in New Mexico, where I shared an apartment with a man named Craig. And Craig and I didn't know each other well, but he stole a desk from me. And it was a nice desk. It was so nice that I wanted my brother, who also lived in New Mexico, to inherit this desk after I left our apartment. There are two things you need to know about my brother Jim. One is that he really loved candy, And the second thing is that time was kind of a suggestion for him. So he wanted the desk, but he didn't come for it until 2 weeks after I had moved out of the apartment. So you're probably thinking Craig was within his rights, but you're mistaken, because he wasn't. I left 2 weeks before my lease was up, and Craig and I had this agreement, and our agreement was, if my brother comes for the desk before my lease is up, he gets it, right? You don't touch it until my lease is up. But after my lease is up, it's all yours. But what did Craig do? He broke our agreement. Immediately after I left, he took the desk, and what's worse, he threw, I had put lots of candy. I told you my brother likes candy. I put lots of candy in the drawers. And not just any candy, not like a Twix, like the kind that you have to go to a special candy store for. And the drawers were all full of the candy, and Craig threw the candy in the garbage. I know, that's the part that always gets everyone. Thank you. No, I'm just kidding. And 15 or 20 years passed, and I was pretty much on my way to forgetting all about Craig. But I couldn't, because suddenly he'd become sort of famous, internet famous, the kind of fame that hinges on a persona, like a good person persona, like a virtue signaling persona, like a I would never steal your desk persona. Yes, like a successful brand. And there's one more thing. I kept running into Craig at an annual conference. And the first time I saw Craig, he was surrounded by fawningly attentive fans. And I said, "Hi, Craig." And he smiled sort of blankly at me. And he said, "Do I know you?" And I said, "Yes, you do." The next year, I saw him give a lecture, and he was critiquing the concept of private property. And sure, I agree. Only those were not the politics that animated like his theft of my desk. And the year after that, we were in line together at a coffee shop. And I said, "Hi, Craig." And he started to say something, but I cut him off. And I said, "You do know me, Craig. And next time, you'll remember my name." Then I took my coffee, and I left. And it wasn't until I was proudly striding down the street when it struck me, and I stopped mid-stride because I realized his name was never Craig. Craig was the name of an entirely different person who never stole a desk from me. So that's my Craig story. Storytelling is a desperate act. There's something we desperately want out of this exchange, and that want is often not dignified. In fact, I think that's why at least I try so hard to make my stories comedic, to mask my desperation. But desperation is the engine. And you don't have to invent like a handful of brothers who all want to sleep with the same woman and end up killing each other to get there. All the nuance and messiness of interpersonal dynamics is already present in the stories you're telling and your reasons for telling them. And so I want to think for just a minute a little bit about context and subtext and how those function in the stories that we tell. I'm compelled, I think, to tell the story about buying every tampon at Walgreens while sobbing because the people who bore witness to this lacked the proper context. And when you contrast that lack of context with my excessive behavior, it creates a comedic tension. While context, refers to circumstances surrounding the focal event or statement and provides clues for its interpretation, subtext is a trickier concept. It's the deeper meaning below the text. But the text, to a degree, also hints at it, right? It's a kind of haunting that intrigues, and it's rife with human desperation. Like a character, for instance, could knock at somebody's door and say, "Have you seen Dan?" Or they could arrive and they could bang at the door and they could say, "Where's Dan? I know he's in there." And the first one makes you wonder, like, "Oh, where's Dan?" But the second one makes you wonder, like, "Hey, what's going on? Like, what happened? Like, what is this history that's animating this present? And yeah, where is Dan? Is he there?" So it's kind of like a deeper sense of intrigue. And it's not just about context. It's about all those wounded feelings of the past and of that circumstance and of that situation, all that baggage that somebody is carrying into the moment with them. As banal as my Craig story is, I think it has the ingredients for a good story, largely because it's actually kind of rich with subtext. And the subtext is desperate, it's incriminating, it's undignified, and it's shameful. If I were to turn this into a fiction, then I'd want to unconceal that desperation that I try so hard to conceal when I tell the story. And basically, it is kind of like a classic narrative structure. A character runs into someone who has wronged them in their past. This someone isn't disgraced. They're actually enjoying a great deal of respect from their community. They can't acknowledge their past offense, either because they don't want to, they don't believe they did anything wrong, or they've forgotten all about it. Maybe they've become a better person. Maybe the offense isn't actually a big deal. Only the protagonist can't let it go. Why can't the protagonist let this go? Needing desperately some audience to recognize Craig's dual offense of 1, having stolen my desk, and 2, having forgotten me, I am compelled to tell the story again and again. And maybe I've also known one too many Craigs. Maybe they've taken more from me than a desk. And maybe I like to tell this story to others who've also known a lot of Craigs, a kind of winner when I'm not a winner. But in telling this story, I do achieve a kind of victory that's intangible, a community of people who've had a common experience and understand where I'm coming from, as petty as I might be in that moment. And so I want you to think about that story that I asked you to tell and think about why you tell it. What do you want? What do you need? When you tell that story, was there a need in the story that went unmet that you're now trying to have met in the telling of it, in the recounting of the narrative? Is there some way that you weren't seen in that story, that you want to be seen? There is a sort of way in which the story that I tell is the text, right? And that my reason for telling it functions as a kind of subtext, right? There's my baggage, the environment, the backstory, all these unspoken wounds and needs and desires that went unfulfilled in the unfolding of the event and which compel me to tell the story. And I think those emotions are somewhat subtextual, and yet they really fuel, in a lot of ways, the energy of that narrative. They're haunting it, right? If I wanted to transform this into a fiction, I would want to, in some ways, dramatize that subtext. And how would I do that? I think I'd make my character's need and the refusal of that need unfold in scene. So my central character might be wary of the new guy at work. He's a social media celebrity. He's become quick friends with all of her friends. He's climbing the ladder really fast. Everybody thinks he's fantastic. But my protagonist knew him once, in their 20s, and his personality was quite different then. In fact, he stole something from her, a really nice desk. And he did it with such impunity, it alarmed her. And for this reason, she can't help but find his current equanimity chilling. Driven too by jealousy of his success, which my protagonist suspects is based on a false persona, she's compelled to antagonize Craig. What's more, he's forgotten her. My protagonist, and I'm saying protagonist because I'm committing fully to hyperbole in fiction. My protagonist is haunted by a question. Is Craig who he says he is? Has he forgotten the past, or is he only pretending? If he's forgotten, then how can she hold him accountable? And if he's pretending to have forgotten, then isn't he also pretending to have transformed into a better person? Isn't he pretending to be someone he isn't? And her friends, well, they begin by believing that the desk theft was forgivable, that she's overreacting, but they've since grown to suspect that it never even happened. And my character will be driven by some inexplicable compulsion to unmask this man, because really by now she's gone too far and she's staked too much. Her credibility, her moral clarity, her likability, and ultimately her sense of self are on the line. And just like Craig, she's clinging desperately to a fiction which she's mistaken for a self. I mean, she might have the wrong guy. After all, Craig, the one she despises, isn't really a person. He's a social phenomenon. And in her sort of obsessed hatred of him, she's sort of becoming a social phenomenon herself. But morally speaking, why tell this story? I believe our stories, as I've kind of hinted at or said overtly, are born out of unmet social needs. And often they're unmet because we don't live in a society that's designed to meet them. And I think on the one hand, when writing about that, it's helpful for me to engage in my own absurdity, too. How ridiculous and unrelenting I might be. How flawed, right? But I also want to take at the same time very seriously that stories are born out of unmet social needs. At least that's the way they function for me. That grief is private, that people become brands, that brands are myopic and an illusion of dependable consistency, which leaves little room for personal growth and accountability. And that's a window for social critique. That's just what I'm performing here, right? That longing is a window for social critique. That longing is something you're not getting in the world that you want. But I'm also a part and a product of this culture. And so anytime I offer a critique, there's going to be a level of absurdity to it, to any critique I can offer. Okay. I have to keep hydrated. All right. We're going to come up on another exercise in a second, but I'm going to do the setup. There's a lot I left out of the stories that I told, and there's also elements that I fabricated. For instance, it wasn't tampons. I got at Walgreens. It was an anti-anxiety medication. And I was sobbing while naming the prescription and having to repeat myself again and again. But that felt too vulnerable for the opening of a talk. And the tampon thing did happen. It just happened in a different context. And I also liked the unruly mass of tampons as kind of this visual. I also altered the Craig story beyond recognition because ironically, I'd actually feel really awful if Craig knew and recognized himself in this story. There's a flash fiction piece, and maybe you're familiar with it. It's called The Harvest, and it's by Amy Hempel, and you can just find it online if you Google it. But the story is about a motorcycle accident wherein her boyfriend nearly accidentally killed her. That's the phrase she uses. And the story ends, and then there's this other section, and the other section begins like this. I leave a lot out when I tell the truth, the same when I write a story. I'm going to start now to tell you what I have left out of The Harvest, and maybe begin to wonder why I had to leave it out. And what follows are several sections where she focuses on different elements of the narrative and kind of does this self-interrogation too, and also this interrogation of storytelling in general. So what I'd like you to do now for this exercise, and I'll give you a couple of minutes, is to think about the story that you told and really kind of mine it for those parts that you left out and why. Are there parts that you altered? And why did you alter them? And I could also envision this as a piece where, like, let's say you tell a story, you transcribe it, you edit the transcribed story, and then you read through it and you, like, put footnotes, right? And you're like, oh, this is a total fabrication. And there's a footnote that kind of interrogates that fabrication. Or in the style of Amy Hempel, where, like, it's this complete solid story, but then there's this other section, and then this other section, where the story just kind of evolves in this sort of unruly way. So I'm going to wrap it up with one final anecdote. And for my final anecdote, I'm going to do something that I've always been told to never do, not in my social interactions, and not in my writing. Don't worry, it's not that bad. To tell about my dreams. It's just that. For a long time, my favorite, like, kind of icebreaker question was like, oh, so you're a doctor. Tell me about your occupational anxiety dreams. And I actually asked my dentist once, and basically the story he told me was Franz Kafka's A Country Doctor. Like, it really was so much so that, like, I started to, like, follow it by quoting Franz Kafka's A Country Doctor. Like, there's this scene where, like, the patient, like, is like, come hither, country doctor. And the country doctor leans in and he says, I have no confidence in you. And, like, I almost quoted it, and then I was like, no, he hasn't read A Country Doctor. He just dreamed it. I have been teaching for like 10 years when every fall I would have this anxiety dream where I'm rushing down this street, my papers are flying out of my arms, and I'm late to this classroom, and I'm rushing, but I also have no idea where I'm trying to go. I don't have a building number, I don't have a room number, I'm just rushing down a street. Sometimes in, like, some iterations of this dream, I arrive at the classroom. And in other iterations of the dream, I arrive at the classroom and I have a textbook, but it's a calculus class, and I don't know calculus. And there's one iteration of the dream in particular where I have this idea, and I'm like, you, put number 1 on the board. And then I'm like, okay, you, put the answer to number 2 on the board. And I'm like, I got this. And then a student raises their hand and they say, Professor Alexander, those are not the answers. And I turn around and I look at the board, and they've written things like tampon, and it's like all a mess. So that's the dream that I would have. And then after my brother died, I started having this dream that I was a student again. And I was completely frazzled. I hadn't, like, really been to class ever. And suddenly I needed to go to class, and I needed to pass these classes, and just getting there was this great impossibility. It was, like, insurmountable. And I didn't understand anything that was expected of me. And yet in the dream, it means a great deal to me. And I, like, almost can't believe that I'm incapable of doing this. And I tell these, even though you're not supposed to tell stories about your dreams, anytime somebody is willing to listen to a story about my dreams, I talk about this. And I think it's because, like, on some level, the meaning of that dream is sort of obvious, but, like, I want something more from it, And so a lot of my talk has been about, like, what we want from another person, what we want intersocially, like interpersonally when we tell stories. But this prompt and this question is about, like, what do we want from the stories? Can they offer us some wisdom? Like, what is it that we want from our stories that we tell? And these might, like, this one might be easier if it's, like, about memory, or if it's about an inherited story, or if it's about a dream. sometimes maybe you kind of like relive a moment in your life. You just replay it again and again and again. And it's like you're searching for some kind of clue in it or some kind of meaning in that moment in your life because it feels really rich or it feels really striking, and yet you don't know what it means. This thing that you lived, this thing that you experienced. And so the last exercise is to think about one of those stories and think about what you want from it. Think about what kind of meaning you're trying to find in it. There's an essay that's called, and so this is kind of for the memoirists out there, there's an essay that's called Memoir as Detective Fiction, and it's by Lindsay Danziger, I believe, Lucy Danziger, and it's called Memoir as Detective Novel. And she gives these two examples, and one of them is from Nicole Chung's memoir, All You Can Never Know. And she has this inherited narrative that she's been given about her adoption and about kind of why her parents put her up for adoption. And she tells that narrative, but then she ends the chapter by sort of finding all of these gaps and fissures in that kind of inherited story, and where these questions emerge, where she has this desire, all of these desires that story just doesn't meet, doesn't fulfill. And so it can be a story that you've been told, and there can be these gaps and these fissures that don't, fully meet your desires. So what do you want from it? How are you kind of the detective telling that story, piecing that together? And the other thing that Danziger says in her essay is that this search for meaning, it doesn't have to be something you do outside of the page. That search, that questioning, can be folded in this example of Nicole Chung's narrative. That search is folded into the structure of the narrative itself. That's all. But I can answer questions or let people go.
Thank you. Sorry. Great, very engaging, a lot of notes that I took that I don't know if they'll make sense when I look at them later. I'm really curious about how much of this meaning needs to be explicitly decided before or during or even after a piece is written. So I love this idea of storytelling as, we're trying to get something out of it, but that also makes me incredibly anxious that I'm telling stories all the time that I don't really know what meaning I'm trying to get across. So I'm curious, do you, it might be personal, it might be just general advice, but do you decide the meaning first, or do you throughout, or are you told the meaning after you write something sometimes?
Yeah, thank you for that, and thank you for all of your kind words at the start of that, and thank you for your question. I think that when I tell stories, interpersonally, I feel like it's a compulsion, and particularly that Craig story, because it wasn't I wasn't really a morally sound person in that narrative. So I was like, why do I keep telling this? And so I just really started to think about it. It was kind of a self-interrogation, but that was a compulsion, that was just something I kept finding myself doing. And so I sort of felt like I was a mystery to myself, and a lot of times I do feel I do think that in memoir writing, in writing, there is that space where there's this kind of unknowable about ourselves. My dream has presented me with this mystery that I keep mining and trying to find meaning in. So, I guess the idea of trying to find meaning, I don't always know the meaning. And the main thing is that it changes. And so that activity with telling a story and transcribing it or recording it, I think it's really useful, or it would be really interesting to engage with different people and tell the same story and see the ways in which the telling of it changes, because you might need different things from different people, and you might need different things at different times. And so with kind of orality, those needs, that narrative alters with those needs. I don't know if I've entirely answered your question, particularly about like the writing portion of it, you know. But I think it is kind of similar to telling stories orally because maybe I think I mean one thing, and then I'll find something later, and I'll be like, huh, why was I doing that? Why was I thinking that? You know, like that there's something in it that I find that I didn't intend to be there that is like sort of revelatory and sometimes embarrassing. You know, sometimes something like I want to be in control of what I'm putting out there, but I'm not always.
Hi, thank you so much for such an intriguing talk and wonderful stories. I'm a historian, so I always think about how the ghosts of the past inform the present. And I work a lot with the sources I use are first-person narratives from the past in different time periods. And I was just intrigued. I'm always interested in ghosts and this notion of hauntings. And I was intrigued in the introduction about hauntology. And you spoke a little bit about kind of this notion of the ways in which narratives are haunted, right, by our unmet desires or our unspoken desires. So I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I do think our narratives are haunted by these unmet desires, and like any kind of ghost, it's sort of like, it's unknown, it's unknowable, it's mysterious, right? And it's from oftentimes something in the past, like perhaps a past trauma. And I think that haunting, like, I think temporally it pulls narratives in two directions, right? Like ghost stories, gothic fiction, and detective narratives are all about how, like, when a plot moves forward, it moves backwards too, right? It's an uncovering of the past, and it's oftentimes some past offense. And so I think subtext in that kind of haunting has that dual motion, right? So like when somebody knocks on the door and they say, is Dan here? It's kind of like the question is only like a forward momentum, really. It's like, where is Dan? Will they find him? Maybe I'm wrong about that. But like then if somebody says, I know he's in here. Where's Dan, right? That really pulls us in two temporal directions, like much more strongly, right? We want to know, like, what's their history? Like, why is this person, like, making an accusation against their neighbor? What happened in the past, but then also what's going to happen? Where is Dan? And does it have anything to do with this history? And I think in ghost stories, usually, like, that's either a false lead in a detective narrative, or it does have something to do with that history. Like the resolution does have something to do with some deep trauma in the past, and kind of like, I don't know, one of the things that when we tell stories, that just happens, that sort of meaning, that past trauma or something, like it's in there and we're not even conscious of it, right? That kind of haunting isn't something we're fabricating. It's just kind of part of being the mystery of being human.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. I love this talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
And I really love the essay's title you quoted, Memoir as Detective Novel, though I still need time to look into it. And I wonder whether it makes a difference to say memoir as detective novel or memoir as a ghost story. Because in a detective story, the murderer is always revealed in the end, and mystery is done. There's a closure to the death, meaning everything, revenge is done, everything's done. While in a ghost story, the ghost sometimes remains in the house and keeps haunting. And there's probably suspension, but there's no closure. So I wonder whether in your narrative or in your stories, you're thinking about telling the story as some kind of closure to your past experience, or is it some kind of suspension and the moment is still open for you?
I love that question so much. I mean, I loved all the questions, but yeah.
I love all my children.
I loved them all equally. No, great questions. I love that one because it taps into like two of my main interests, which is like detective narratives and hauntology, like ghost stories. And I think that there's a way, like, I think a lot about like Agatha Christie novels, how like this is the way I answer questions. I don't answer them. I'm just kind of like gonna jump off like this springboard. But like with Agatha Christie novels, there's like this rift in the social fabric, right? But by the end of that narrative, that rift is going to be like, it's going to be like healed, right? Like, and I think of that rift as not just like a rift in the social fabric, but a rift in our understanding, like that it's sort of like our consciousness, our logic lays a map onto the world that makes it predictable. So we don't really see the world, we sometimes just see our map of the world. And so, you know, like the detective novel, the mystery, tears that open. There's this unknown, but it will always be explained away. Like sometimes even something sort of supernatural happens at the start of an Agatha Christie novel, but it's always explained away. The world always ends as something that we can understand, something that we can trust, and the social fabric is something that can be depended upon. But then there's these other kinds of narratives where, I'm trying to think of the name of it. Gosh, I used to know. Like a sort of detective narrative that rift just grows wider and wider and wider as the narrative progresses, and the world utterly becomes something unknowable. And those are the kinds of narratives that get into the realm of like hauntology, that get into the realm of the speculative and the ghost story and the horror story. So that didn't answer your question at all, but I just wanted to like, it's like I'm playing an instrument with you.
It's jazz.
A great jam session. Let's have one more round of applause for Jess, please. Thank you so much. So if you want to keep learning from Jess, there's still time to sign up for her July week-long workshop, Mystery, Suspense, and Fascination in Fiction and Nonfiction. The 11th Hour Lecture Series continues tomorrow with Joe Fassler giving a lecture called Good Beginnings, Crafting the Novel's First Chapter. Thanks for coming. Have a great lunch. See you tomorrow, hopefully.